In this video, we're going to explore the scaling capabilities of Quincy. We're primarily going to focus on processing because that's the easiest place to understand it, but it really works across any job that you want Quincy to run for you. We're going to talk about understanding the underlying architecture of Quincy so you get a better idea of how this works, configuring jobs, and installing multiple listeners. All right. It's worth spending a few moments contrasting the way our existing architecture utilized by Lab and FTK work relative to how Quincy works. On the left here, you have a picture of a simplified AD Lab architecture where you have FTK, or the clients, interacting with a database and a DPM. The DPM in turn interacts with as many workers as you have set up. I believe our max is around 14 to 16. The way it works is FTK submits a job, I believe, to the database, and then the DPM looks in the database and sees that there's a job, picks up the job, and then splits that individual job among however many workers it has, manages the communication between the workers, and ultimately puts the result back in the database and notifies the client that it's done. This is an extremely powerful architecture when dealing with very large single images. Let's say you have an image, an individual image that let's say is 100 terabytes, something huge. This is the ideal architecture for dealing with it because it will divide that huge image up between a large number of workers, do a divide and conquer, and quickly push through the data as fast as really your database will allow, and get your results really, again, as quickly as can be done. The drawback of the architecture is, of course, twofold. One is managing the connection between the workers and the DPM and managing the division of work and putting that data back together in an intelligent way is what limits the number of workers we can have. It's that communication and that complexity that caps us out at around the 14 to 16 right now. We're obviously always pushing it up, but that's where we are at the moment. The other issue is because of that complexity and this individual bottleneck, the number of jobs that AD Lab likes to work on at any given time is generally capped to between 3 to 6. Now, there is no loss of productivity as a result of that. It just means that it will queue up the other jobs, and when the 3 to 6, whatever it's configured for, are done, when there's a spot available, it will pick up the other job and start running it. It will get through all the work very quickly, but there is that dynamic where if you submit the 7th job, you can be in a queue behind the other 6, and that can be frustrating. Quincy has a very different architecture. This is, again, a simplified image of it, but Quincy is a standalone entity, and it's got everything, if you will, in a self-contained install, and it communicates directly with the database. So you can hook up, let's say, 1,000 Quincy's, point them at the database, and each one of them operates independently. So if one of the Quincy's stuffs into the database and says, hey, here's a job, any other one of these Quincy's can pick it up, run the job, and put the results back in the database. The result is twofold. One is you can have much greater scale. You can scale the number of these processors into very large numbers. Again, the bottleneck being your database. And you can work on as many jobs as you have Quincy installed listeners looking at the database. So if you have 16 jobs and 16 listeners and everything's set up correctly, each listener will pick up a job and start running it. And when it's done, it will put it back and say, I'm available for another job. So the drawback, though, is, of course, each job runs at the speed allowed by the listener that has picked it up. So if you have a 100 terabyte case, as we did in our example over here, that 100 terabyte case will only run as fast as the listener that picked it up can process it. And so you invariably, if you're going to run giant cases like that, you either need some machines that have huge hardware on them, or you're going to need some hybrid approach, which is what we'll show you in the next slide. However, there are advantages for organizations that aren't going to have that 100 terabyte case, or at least have it infrequently. One is no jobs really ever sit in a queue if you have enough processors to work on them, number one. Number two is most jobs are never 100 terabytes. You will rarely run into an individual image that is that large. It's much more likely that you have lots of sort of 2 terabyte or 1 to 2 terabyte cases, and so you can tack them all at once. And then finally, and most importantly, you really never, because you don't have a queue, and because you can configure what jobs each Quincy is going to pick up, you never have this dynamic where somebody's labeling job is waiting behind some giant processing job. So he's trying to use the system to run a label, right? Something that should be quick and simple, but there are already 6 large processing jobs ahead of him, and therefore he is stalled. Now, of course, you can do techniques to prevent that from happening here as well. I don't want to suggest this is an active problem with lab, but the architecture of Quincy is more conducive to eliminating those type of issues. So let's talk about the hybrid, or excuse me, let's talk about some of the differences. I think I've already highlighted them here. A large single lab image, a large single image lab does better than Quincy. Obviously, Quincy can do it, it's just slower, so don't misread the word no here. It's just that this has a competitive differentiation. Many images, Quincy is better at. Scale limit, this is sort of the 14 to 16. There really is no scale limit. Again, if you have the hardware, the database hardware that can support all the different entities hitting it. And then load balancing, Quincy is naturally set up to support load balancing, whereas lab isn't, though our engineers can configure it to enable load balancing. I have seen that done, but it's just not a sort of out-of-the-box thing. It's not nearly as simple. You can combine the best of both worlds. Quincy allows for this. So you could have one Quincy in your environment that is effectively a front end for lab. Quincy can obviously easily communicate with lab and communicate with their DPE processing structure. So if you wanted to set up one Quincy that had the ability to process that 100 terabyte image, you can go ahead and do that. That's not particularly tricky. So let's go in now and try to see how this all works actually in the tool and try to set up a multi-listener environment. So I have my primary listener here, or at least I have a listener set up and hitting the database. And we can run jobs, we can do whatever we want, we can operate in this Quincy, no problem. But if we go into job status and we look at Quincy workers, we're going to see we only have one. Now, I believe there's a video dedicated to this job status and discusses Quincy workers and all that kind of stuff. So I won't spend a ton of time on it. However, let's briefly discuss it. We only have one worker here. If we click on it, it will show us the jobs this worker can run. Because this is a single install environment, I've configured it to run every job, as I think most people would do. This means whether or not I send a processing job, an add evidence, or a labeling job, it gets submitted to this environment, this worker, and this worker handles it when it is able to and produces the result to the database. Let's show what happens when we turn off a job. So we're going to turn off folder monitor and folder assignment. I'm not really sure which one of these is labeling. Actually, I'm pretty positive it's this one. So let's turn off folder assignment. Let's go ahead and save that. I'm going to need to restart the listener. So I will pause while I do that, and I will resume back into this same page. Okay, we restarted our listener, and we've come back to the screen. You can see it is as we left it. Only now the server will acknowledge the fact that it's not allowed to do labeling jobs, which again here are called folder assignment.
So let's go and prove that out. We've logged into a case, and I'm going to open my grid up here, and I'm just going to go select 2 records, which are already selected, frankly. And a label's already chosen, and let's just go click apply labels. Now it looks like it's applied them. You think, oh, what's going on? There are the labels, Tim, but those are just applied locally. If we refresh, we're going to see they disappear. And now if we go to our job status and do get jobs, you're going to see this one job is stuck in the submitted state, and it's going to be there indefinitely because it's a labeling job and no worker is currently looking for labeling jobs. So now what we need to do is to go to our other machine and configure it to look for labeling jobs. So let me show you how that works. I'm just going to log out and hop back into a different machine. I've already installed Quincy on this machine, just a normal install. But if I were to fire it up, you'd see it would go nowhere because it's got no database. I didn't install the database because I'm going to point it at the database on the other machine. So let's just prove that out a little bit. We started up our server. Now if we start up Quincy, we'll get to the login, but we're not going to be able to get beyond that. It's just going to sit here and cycle forever. And I'm going to spare you the misery of just watching it and waiting for it to fail. It's not going anywhere. So let's go ahead and kill that and then let's point this at the database on the 120 machine. And to do that, we need to open up dbconfig. If you're not familiar with dbconfig, it is in every Quincy install. So just come to C program files or wherever you installed it. It by default will go here. Access data, and then dbconfig. All right, now we're looking for dbconfig.exe. Dbconfig, there we go. And we're going to run that. Okay, start it up. And you can see it's got some databases installed, but I can promise you there are no databases on this machine. This was from a previous install. We're going to have to go ahead and add a configuration. And we want to point it again at that remote machine. So let's call this demo. And then we need to go get the server name of that remote machine. So I'm going to hop back onto my other machine. And I'm going to go get my computer's name. Properties. You can actually just take it from here, but since I'm already halfway through this, I'll just grab it here. All right, now let me go back and just paste it there, and that should be enough. Go ahead and connect, and it should create a new configuration. Okay, it did it, and there it is, demo, and we want to set that as our configuration, and we're good to go now. Now let's prove that that's working out. Let's restart our server, and then let's relog in. Actually, let me do something. Let me relog in Chrome. All right, and here we are able to get by the login screen, and we're going to be up and running in a second. So I'm going to pause the video while it loads, and then I'll start it when it's up and running. Okay, so we logged in. It's up and running now. I actually skipped over some of the initialization steps because this is a new install, and it popped up that sort of hello to Quincy stuff, but I've spared you all of that and jumped over it. The reason we bothered to log in at all was to go into the admin widget. There are a few things we need to change in the config file, which you could do directly in the config file, or you can do through the UI. I think it's a little bit easier through the UI. but what we're looking for is this. Is job master, since this is the second one in our install, we're going to say false. And then we have to provide it with the link of the job master. So we need the machine name of our old machine again, and we got to post that right in here. So let me track that down again. And let me pull this stuff out. Okay, those are the changes we need to make into the config file. Go ahead and just save them. It'll make those changes. Now, let me show you how you do that. If you didn't want to go into the UI, you just wanted to hop into the config, you can of course do that. You have to find your config file. I've already got it loaded here, but generally it is located at this direction, at this location, excuse me, Program Files, Access Data, Quincy, and then you're looking for a file called adg.selfhost.exe.config. And what we just changed was these two things. I'd have to reload it, but they would be changed to the old values, to the new values. So if you want to manually do it, just come in, change this and change that, and you're off and running. Okay, now let's go back to the old machine and set up the workers. Okay, so we've added a worker to this environment, and now we want to configure it. So we're going to go ahead, click here, and now we have to get the machine name of the new worker we added. To do that, it's just as simple as this. Take out that HTTP stuff, and we go ahead and save that. Now here you can see you have the option of deleting or restarting if this thing goes down. You can't do that on your primary listener, but for each additional worker you add, you'll get these options. Now, let's go ahead and click on this, and you can see right now it has no jobs registered to it. So let's go ahead and add the folder assignment job and just save that. Now it's going to tell us we're going to need to restart the listener on that machine. Just as an FYI, you can select everything if you want by clicking these buttons and unselect them that way. It's just a real time saver. So it's told us to restart that listener, so let's go back and do that. We're just going to close that down. And then restart. All right, it's up and running. Now, if everything worked properly and we go to job status, it should have picked up the labeling job and run it. So let's just see that. Hopefully I refresh and this will disappear. And it did. Excellent. So it ran the job. So now we have a worker that's running the jobs for labeling, and we have another worker that's running every other job. So you can see if we click on this, it's running every other job, and this one's just folder labeling. So we have, if you will, a complete set of workers. You can utilize this capability to be intelligent and targeted in terms of what hardware you're using for what, and how you're giving your users the most, if you will, bang for your hardware buck. You can make the big machines do add evidence and process evidence or imports, or the things that are heavy duty. Maybe have one dedicated to OCRing. You maybe have the smaller machines do label assignments or run search reports or whatever. You sort of decide based on your knowledge of your users what they're going to utilize a lot, what they're not going to utilize a lot, things of that nature. And you can get a very efficient deployment of the Quincy software. So hopefully that made sense. This is a complex subject. So again, feel free to post questions to the message board, ask for clarification, do whatever you need to get the knowledge you need to be successful. Anyway, I hope that was helpful, and thank you very much.